Today is May 6th, 2015. My name is Teresa Larson. I am speaking with Edward R. Gagnier, but I know you as Ed. May I call you Ed?
Oh, you certainly can.
All right. Do I have your permission, Ed, to record your voice and your face and some pictures today?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for joining us.
Oh.
The very first question I always ask people who are involved with our Shared Stories project is when and where were you born?
Well, actually, I was born on February 1st, 1936, in Windsor, Ontario. Now, that's only about a mile from Detroit, in case people are wondering where Windsor is.
Tell me just a little bit about your family. What did your father do, and what was your family involved in at Windsor, Canada?
Well, originally, my family, father and mother were involved in farming. But when they moved from a city not too far from Windsor to the city of Windsor, my father was a motor mechanic, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom.
You, I know from previously talking with you, you initially went to a Catholic school, is that right? A Catholic grammar school?
Yes, right, I did. St. Bernard was through 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And then 9th grade, of course, was the beginning of high school. And then I went to a technical high school.
Now tell me about that decision. Why did you feel a technical high school was a good match for you?
That's an interesting question, because I somehow, as a youngster, having gone to a Catholic high school, I had the feeling that I was being prepared to be a priest. And that's one thing I just didn't want to do. And the only way in Windsor, if you graduated from a Catholic Catholic under class, 8th grade school, that you then had to go to a Catholic high school. And I wasn't interested in doing that. And the only way that I was allowed to do otherwise was if I decided to go to a technical high school. And of course that was my decision. And I never have regretted it, of course, but that's how it happened.
I recall learning that that was such a pivotal decision for so many reasons, because there was a gymnastics club at the technical high school.
Of course, when I went there, W.D. Lowe Vocational High School is what it was called, I really didn't know they had a gymnastics program. In fact, the program was not an official varsity sport at the high school. It was a club sport. And the gentleman, Bernie Newman, was the coach. He handled this club activity, and in a way that really was very beneficial for me and provided a great opportunity to go on to college as a result of my gymnastics participation.
Did you find the coach, or did the coach find you? How did it happen that you found this wonderful match?
Well, I'm sure I wasn't recruited. Frankly, I just happened to see the gymnast performing in the gym one day, and this was early on in my freshman year, and decided that might be fun. I always liked hanging on the bars and rolling in the grass, and so I really thought that this would be something that I would enjoy. Of course, I played in other sports and played hockey and lacrosse, and I did swimming and diving, but none of those sports really attracted me quite the same way that the tumbling on the mat seemed to get my attention.
How much did you practice or work out a week?
Well, we really worked pretty hard, actually. Most of the gymnasts did not participate in any other sports, and so we had all the time after school to be in gymnastics year-round. And of course, we would practice just about every day, except for Sundays, say, and we'd work out on Saturday mornings. But it was, when I look back and think of how the sport itself was not given that top billing, and the fact we had to share the gym, many times we'd be tumbling in the halls. We'd bring all our mats out, and the pommel horse and the parallel bars put in the hallway and practice. But the gymnasts all really didn't mind that. They loved the sport. And I really thought that that was something that I could do and really enjoying, so I stuck with it.
Tell me about the coach's personality and the kind of motivation that the coach provided. Because this seems as if it's not a varsity sport, so you're not going to get a letter. It's a club, so there must have been something about this person that was quite magnetic.
Well, of course, we're quite lucky that he had that interest. Frankly, he had a background. He was a health instructor. Taught the subject of health, and but his background was from show business. He had performed a professional three-man act in many places, and so he came from that background of understanding tumbling, and then of course, for whatever reason, he started the club. It was already in operation when I started school. But he had that personal interest in the sport as it developed, and as our team became, the gymnasts got better and better, he would take us to more and more locations to participate in the sport of gymnastics. Well, as it turned out, in Canada, none of the high schools had gymnastics. And actually, there were very few opportunities to participate in competitions. But we could go to places, and Mr. Newman would arrange to take us to these places in his automobile, and he'd get another instructor that was willing and interested in gymnastics to take some in his automobile. But we'd go to places like Dayton, Ohio, and go to Cincinnati, Ohio. We'd go to Indianapolis, Detroit, Chicago, and we seemed to travel more than any of the varsity sports at the school. It was really an interesting situation for us because during the year, we'd have at least 10 competitions that we'd go to. And then, of course, whenever we'd come back, athletes from other sports say, well, where did you go this time? Of course, their competitions were mostly in the city and suburban areas and never really traveled anywhere near as much as we did. In fact, we traveled to such an extent that after 4 years, our coach had estimated that we had traveled the equivalent of 25,000 miles altogether. Some of our competitions, although there were some, I mentioned that around Windsor they didn't have high school competitions, but there were some national and regional competitions, and one time we even drove all the way to Vancouver, British Columbia for a Canadian championship. So we did some extensive traveling. And I didn't come from a very wealthy family, and we didn't fly to competitions. We always drove, and I hardly had any money, really. But the coach would always provide the transportation, and all we had to do was pay for our meals. And somehow we'd managed to find places to sleep where we could sleep 3 or 4 in a bed, and really that wasn't very costly. And so that's how we managed to go all these places and not really have to worry about the finances all that much.
I happen to know that you were a collegiate champion at the University of Michigan. So somehow get me from this wonderful high school experience to the University of Michigan. How did you come to their attention, and how did they come to your attention?
Well, of course, at the collegiate level in the United States, they've always recruited. They've gone to competitions. They've seen athletes at various meets, and there were coaches that had seen me perform at some of these Sokol events or YMCA events that were being held like in Chicago or somewhere, and so I had fortunately done fairly well, and so there were schools like Penn State and Illinois and Michigan in particular, Michigan State, of course, that had shown an interest in my going to school in the United States. Well, I really didn't hesitate, because at the time I was in high school, I thought that, gosh, if I had this opportunity to compete at the collegiate level, I would have to go to the United States, because they didn't even have collegiate gymnastics in Canada. And so it was a no-brainer in the sense that this is where I was going to end up if I had the opportunity. And fortunately for me, there were several opportunities there. And I did select the University of Michigan. To give you an idea of how financially speaking, I mean, there's always some costs beyond what scholarship you're going to receive. And I can remember the Newt Loken, who was the head coach at the University of Michigan, driving to Windsor, which is only about 45 miles. But he would drive to my house, which was legal at that time, and load me up with all my stuff and take me back to Ann Arbor, where this is where I would be going to school.
It was a little bit more casual in terms of intercollegiate athletics at that time. Just
it
a
certainly
little
was.
bit. Tell me a little bit about your teammates at the University of Michigan.
Well, of course, there were some teammates that after I had, actually there was one teammate from high school that had already gone to the University of Michigan, somewhat broken the ice from the standpoint of, well, this is a place where you could be successful. And he did very well there. He was about 3 years ahead of me, actually 4 years, because when I got there he'd already graduated. But at any rate, there were several athletes after I had gone there that were recruited from Canada. But the University of Michigan, being the university with renowned reputation, recruited nationwide. And this was typical. Athletes would come from all the states, the different states, and so we had a pretty good representation from all over.
Actually, your experience in your technical high school with Mr. Newman, he kind of prepared you for this wide view of attitudes and places by traveling. So when you came to the university, you already had an understanding that the world was bigger than just a little oyster.
And that helped a lot. There was no doubt about it, because not only did I have a chance to go to these locations, but I would also meet people there. And that made me more comfortable. I knew these coaches that were trying to recruit me in advance. And so it wasn't a strange experience for me to have an opportunity to visit their school and to see their facilities and to visit with the coach and be offered an opportunity to go there. So yeah, but Ann Arbor, of course, wasn't that far. And so that made it just a little bit easier.
You're a gentleman and a humble man, so I know I'm going to have to probably pry this out of you. But I want to have you tell me the events that were your specialties and the kinds of awards that you won in those competitions.
Well, from the very beginning, I was introduced to the all-around event, which involved 6 events in gymnastics: the pommel horse, the parallel bars, the rings, the horizontal bar, tumbling, and the horizontal bar. In addition to that, we had swinging rings, and we had trampolining, and we had basic tumbling, which floor exercise involved. And we even had rope climbing. And so I just seemed to enjoy doing all those things. Now, as you move through the collegiate level, the events tapered down to where there were only 6 events, the 6 Olympic events. And of course, those were the ones that I tended to specialize in college. As far as in Canada, I was very fortunate in that I was able to actually win the Canadian National Championship in the all-around in several of the events that I participated in. Of course, this is what helped too in exposing my opportunities to go to the university. At the University of Michigan, unfortunately, I only had an opportunity to participate in gymnastics there for 2 years. The freshmen were ineligible. That was automatic at that time. I participated as a sophomore and a junior. And then in my senior year, unfortunately, I was injured and I didn't participate in gymnastics. But in the 2 years that I was there, I felt that I had a very successful career and that I was able to win the conference all-around championship. And in addition, at that time, I also qualified and participated on the Canadian Olympic team that went to Melbourne, Australia in 1956.
That must have been a real thrill.
Well, for any Olympian to go to the Olympics, it's a thrill, there's no doubt about it. But there's something about representing your country when you go to an event like that, because of the exposure you are given in meeting athletes from all over the world. And all of a sudden you have an extra bit of pride in your own country, particularly when, and then coming from Canada or the United States, I'm sure most of the athletes from other countries seemed to be somewhat envious, and you sort of felt extra special as a result. And in turn, you felt obligated to just perform your very best and to act your very best at all times.
Of course, I would like to get you from your University of Michigan experience to Iowa State University. And there you had an interval, of course you graduated from the university,
Right.
and then you were actually a coach in some different levels, the high school level. Do I recall that correctly?
Right. Actually, when I graduated right on time. This is where I met Carolyn, my wife. That she went to high school in Flint, Michigan, and she was in nursing school at the University of Michigan. She was basically 1 year behind in terms of her schooling, and so when we got married, I had just graduated, but Carolyn had 1 more year remaining. So I stayed at the University of Michigan as an assistant gymnastics coach, and also was able to earn my master's degree. Now, after that, I wanted to, after having had the experience of being in Canada where they did not have gymnastics, no scholarships, I've always had the hope, I thought I'd want to work with the very upper level of gymnasts. And in gymnastics, of course, that's a collegiate level. There's no professional gymnastics. And so I wanted to coach the college level. But I wasn't able to, well, at that time I didn't know how to really approach it. I wasn't sure how you, as a college graduate, that you could obtain a coaching position at a university. But I knew that I could qualify for a high school. And so well, that's an interesting development the way it occurred, because I was offered an opportunity to coach at Evanston High School. And we all but signed the papers, and I was ready to go there. This was after I'd gotten my master's degree, and Carolyn had graduated, and we were ready to move. But the very last minute, I was informed that they could not hire me in Illinois because I was not a U.S. citizen. And that after the Second World War, they had, in the state of Illinois, had a policy that unless you were a U.S. citizen, that you could not teach in a high school.
Wasn't that just deflating?
Well, that Evanston High School was like coaching at a college.
Yes,
it was a terrific.
It's quite a suburb. Yes,
and a very wealthy suburb, and with the facilities that were just beyond anyone's imagination. Their facilities there were comparable to any in the United collegiate facilities. At any rate, yes, it was quite a disappointment. But fortunately, I was able to qualify for a job at Brown Deer High School in suburban Milwaukee. And so for 2 years, I taught school there, and of course in physical education, and also coached their boys' gymnastics team. And so after 2 years there, I had still this interest in coaching at the collegiate level. And I decided that my best opportunity, by that time I had sort of developed somewhat of a strategy here now, because I just knew that the schools that already had gymnasts had coach. And so it was very unlikely that I could bump somebody out of a job. Anyway, I decided that I would obtain the Blue Book of College Athletics that listed all the universities in the United States. And I sorted through those and determined that probably only the universities that had over 10,000 students would probably be interested in supporting a gymnastics program if they didn't have one, that they would be interested in starting one up. And so I wrote to as many as I could to schools like Iowa State that did not have a men's gymnastics program and offered to start a program. If they were interested, I felt that I was capable of doing this for them. And by Jiminy, I ended up getting an offer here from Iowa State. And even then, it wasn't a sure thing. But
now, who was the athletic director at that time?
And this was Gordon. It was Gordon Chalmers. And that's an interesting story in that I was so fortunate in being able to get this job, in that Gordon Chalmers had been the swimming coach at Annapolis. No, he was a swimming coach at West Point.
Okay.
And when he took the head directorship at Iowa State, of course, he had come from that background, and he had also established, as a swimmer, he wasn't an athlete, he was a coach there in swimming. And he had had a relationship with the gymnasts at West Point. And he knew them. And so when I came in for an interview at Iowa State, he said, well, now I want you to understand that I'm interviewing two people for this job. And the other was a pommel horse champion from West Point that he knew. And he said, I've already interviewed him. And I said, you're the second being interviewed, and I'm going to decide between the two of you. And he said, one of the things that I want to know is if you'd be willing to teach classes other than coaching gymnastics. And of course, well, I expected this. There was no question about it. I knew I just couldn't coach gymnastics. At least that's how I understood it. But apparently the young man from West Point said that no, there was no way he was going to teach, that all he wanted to do is coach gymnastics. Now, I felt fortunate, so fortunate, because I know that Gordon Chalmers, knowing this other gymnast, would have probably hired him. If he'd have said what I did, sure, there's no problem, I'll teach. And the reason that I know that is that Gordon Chalmers told me before I left after the interview, he said, yes, you've got the job, but I want you to know that this other person that I'd interviewed did not want to coach, or did not want to teach classes. And he said, that's one of the reasons why I've decided to hire you.
I think there's a lesson there for people to stay open-minded when they go for interviews.
That was a lot of luck on my part, I can assure you.
Well, a lot of willingness on your part, too. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is about 1961.
That's right.
That you came to
Came,
Iowa State. And so when you came, there was no gymnastics program. You have a blank slate.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of the remarkable aspects of your story, Ed.
Oh.
I talked to a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
but you walked in and you just had to start it.
Mm.
So you were teaching physical education. Was that partly where you recruited your your gymnasts?
Well, it's true that some of the gymnasts may have come from that opportunity where I coached beginning gymnastics.
Mm-hmm.
This was a course required for physical education majors. There were some athletes in there that, in learning of a new gymnastics program, probably shifted over to the club sport of gymnastics. Although I'm not that certain how many, frankly, being that new, and the fact that here I was just so thrilled that I was now a university level gymnastics coach, even at the club level, that I didn't even consider facilities or anything like that. And having had this picture of what the high school at Evanston, Illinois provided, I thought to myself, well, actually I was very surprised, and I found out that the gymnastics area was a handball court underneath the east bleachers of the football stadium. And with a sloped ceiling, because the bleachers slope, and this handball court was now converted, or supposedly this was the designated area for men's gymnastics. And so for about a year and a half, we worked underneath those bleachers, and I never really thought about the fact that, well, now these facilities are not adequate. I was just so busy trying to recruit athletes from the university, and also I started at that time recruiting from the high schools. And the one state that I concentrated on the heaviest was Illinois. They had a terrific high school gymnastics program. And so I started my scouting, recruiting, and communicating with these high school potential Iowa Staters early on, of course not knowing if they'd come or not. And one of the big concerns that I had at the time that I really wasn't even aware of, except that to some extent I knew that well, we didn't have any scholarships. There were none. And what was going to be my hook? Well, how was I going to approach these athletes in high school that were looking for scholarships at universities? They'd been in high school gymnastics for 4 years, won state championships. They were every bit as good as any of the other athletes nationwide coming out of high school, and they expected some financial assistance. Well, I used the strategy pointing out that, well, here's Iowa State University, one of the major universities in the nation that's starting a gymnastics program. And if you decide to come to Iowa State, I can almost guarantee you that you will make the starting lineup immediately. And so that was a hook that I used that really paid great dividends. And it worked this way for several years, actually. And as our program got better, then we did have scholarships. But at the beginning, I was using that tactic in order to attract athletes to Iowa State.
You came in 1961, but your first official team was in 1963?
Right.
Okay.
We had a club sport in 62, a team that we were preparing that were doing pretty well with some of these boys that I'd recruited from Illinois that next year, and the fact that they were managing to learn the skills necessary for competition. And some of them, of course, competed for 4 years in high school. And so it wasn't like I was starting from absolute scratch, although there was some of the athletes at Iowa State that did come through from the university without any prior experience that did very well. These guys were doing exhibitions at basketball games, and whenever we could, we would enter some sort of unofficial competition. At that time, Gordon Chalmers asked me whether I could now justify competing at the collegiate level. Oh, goodness, of course. It didn't matter if we were last or whatever. But our first official team was in 1963. And we felt so great in that we met Kansas and Kansas State, the first two teams. Those were the first two meets we ever had, and we won both of them. By just a little bit, but gosh, here's a brand new bunch of guys getting together, going to another major university, two major universities, winning them both. And so at that point, of course, just prior to that though, Gordon Chalmers had asked me what I thought I'd have to have budget-wise if they were to classify gymnastics now as a varsity sport, an official Big 8 sport. And I told him, I said, well, of course, there were several opportunities to fudge a little bit in terms of travel. We had a carpool to university, and that sort of didn't count in the budget. And I said, well, I need to have at least $400.
You're laughing. You asked for $400.
It's such a ridiculous figure. And he said, okay, I'm going to present this to the board. And so the board approved gymnastics. Now I'm sure they laughed about it when they heard the figure, but they knew from what I had suggested that I was planning to keep costs down to a minimum, and that I didn't expect, what other sports were receiving, and that I was willing to work my way up. And so they went ahead and approved it. And I was very lucky there in that the way they handled the budgets at that time, it wasn't like they said, okay, now you spent so much of this, you only have so much left. And Gordon Chalmers was very supportive of gymnastics, having come from a swimming background and having been close to gymnastics. He sort of favored gymnastics somewhat in terms of a personal sport. And whenever we go to competitions, he'd tell me, well, don't worry. Just don't worry about it, just go. And so I'm sure we spent way, way more than the $400. But it was just the right amount for us to achieve the success we did. And of course, that first year we didn't win many competitions. I think we won 2 and lost about 4 of them. But at any rate, that was the beginning, 1963.
We were talking about people that might have been recruited from other aspects of university life. Didn't you have a team captain that was actually a wrestler that you kind of convinced to move over?
Well, actually, he convinced himself. East bleachers also accommodated the wrestling team. And we would go, our 2 handball courts they knocked the wall down between the 2, and that was the gymnastics area. Then the next area was 2 handball courts, or 3, because wrestling was a varsity sport, and they participated there, all right, just down the hall, underneath the bleachers. Well, Bob Stewart, who was a wrestler, a freshman wrestler, every day after his practice, of course, he would walk past the gymnastics area. And he looked in there one day, and several days probably, and he told me later, he said, you know what, I made a decision that I was more interested in gymnastics from what I could see than in wrestling. And so he made a switch from wrestling to gymnastics. And that's unusual. Very few wrestlers become gymnasts.
But I do like the story.
He was, early on in his career, he was able to do this, and fluently, I mean, you know, with grace and everything. And he actually became good enough to be designated as the team captain for our second team. That was in 1964.
Do I recall that in 1966, though, you won the conference championship? Do I recall that correctly?
Well, very closely, yes. In the third season, this was, in my mind, just a pinnacle of what we'd accomplished at that point. It was our third year, and David Block, who came out of who knows where, from Storm Lake, Iowa, and he saw us practicing one day and decided, hey, I want to give that a try. He was our team captain that year. And later, Dave Block, of course, stayed at the university in architecture. He was nationally renowned for passive solar heating in his architectural work. And he also was a member later on of the athletic council. And he just recently retired from the university. But at any rate, he was our third team captain, and we won the conference championship that year.
It's remarkable to me that you came in 1961, and the only thing that you really had for your program was an area under some football bleachers. Mm-hmm. And then by 1966, you had conference championship. What's the coaching philosophy that gets you there?
Well, you can talk to 40 different coaches and they'll come up with 40 different approaches to coaching. I think that I was successful initially because of my emphasis on perfection rather than difficulty. In the sport of gymnastics, you're required to do certain skills in order to attain a maximum score of 10. Now, the deductions occur as you do these skills in terms of the way you did them. Were they virtuous? Did you break form? Did you lose control? Whatever. So you lose points. But I found that we didn't have the ability to have routines that were rated as a 10. Rather than trying to have my gymnasts perform maximum value routines, I encouraged them. And I wasn't always successful because gymnasts always want to do more than they think they can do. But I was successful for the most part in convincing them that it would be better if they did a skill that they had perfect rather than to try something that they would make an error on, fall off the equipment, or break form. And that if they could perform a routine that might have been worth 80% of the maximum score, that in the end they might score higher than if they had full difficulty. And they bought into it. And as a result, we were able to win the majority of our meets, not necessarily having the best skills out there, but having the best routines.
You sound like a really strategic thinker.
Well, it worked at that time. So
I want to come back to the collegiate level, but there's something else that's happened concurrently. As a community member, you are also helping younger children with tumbling. Mm-hmm. And you are, of course, you're probably looking for possible people that you could groom and, mm-hmm. and encourage to enjoy mm-hmm. the sport on a collegiate level, mm-hmm. mostly boys, obviously. Mm-hmm. But tell me about being involved, because there are many people, of course they know you as a collegiate coach, but they might not know about your involvement with some of the younger students mm-hmm. In Ames, Iowa.
Well, I felt very, having come from a background of a club sport, and having worked with girls and boys at that time when I was in high school, and I was comfortable with working with or being exposed to young children in the sport. And I'm not just sure how this evolved exactly, but I know that Gordon Chalmers' daughter, Donna Chalmers, was a very talented dancer. And he asked me one day if she could practice in our gym. And I said, well, of course, no problem with that. Come in, we've got tumbling mats. And she performed. And she had some friends that also liked dancing and might like gymnastics that wanted to try it out. And so on Saturday mornings, when we didn't have men's gymnastics practice, I opened up our gym and I'd have them come in and practice. And from that evolved the Ames Gymnastics Club, with more and more children being involved. We then expanded the program for children in the off hours, like on Tuesday nights and Thursday nights for an hour, and then on Saturday mornings. And so, gosh, at one time we had dozens and dozens of youngsters from the city of Ames that wanted to participate in gymnastics. Now, fortunately, there were other schools or other clubs in Iowa that also had children's programs, and they would support gymnastics competitions. And we had some in Beyer Hall for the state children to come over and participate in gymnastics. But we also did exhibitions at the basketball games, and we do exhibitions at the high school events. And so there were opportunities to show their skills, and that was fun. And having a chance just to work with city children really, I think, gave me an added incentive to operate in this fashion because of the exposure that gymnastics received as a result of it. And I felt too that this wasn't a total waste of time from the standpoint of my varsity program. In fact, there were several, two in particular, that came out from the Ames Gymnastics Club. These were the Buck brothers. There were three of them. Peter Buck, who was a surgeon here in Ames, and Stu Buck, who became an art teacher in Bondurant, and then Lindy, or Mason Buck, who passed away at an early age when he was in California. But those athletes, except for Peter Buck, who then switched over to golf, Stu Buck and Mason, or Lindy Buck, he was also Mason Lindy, both became All-Americans at Iowa State in gymnastics, even though they had no high school background. And so I felt that in a way, gosh, I was developing my own recruiting area here for future gymnasts, although that was short-lived from the standpoint that as we became a stronger sport, now I was able to attract gymnasts not only from Illinois, but from states all over the country. Yeah. And so it was a little difficult at that time. And then I started to concentrate more on providing gymnastics for youngsters as a recreational activity, not as a competitive activity.
So let's switch back to collegiate. And we kind of left off at the 1966, your first conference championship.
It was 65.
65,
actually.
sorry.
Yeah, 65.
So tell me a little bit more about the high points of this wonderful collegiate coaching career before we get to your transition to another one. I mean, what are the moments when you just said, "Oh, I'm so thankful that I came to Iowa State and Ames," and maybe you can tell me about some athletes that you worked with that maybe thrilled you, some of your personal stories that you'll always carry with you.
Well, early on, of course, as we were developing here at Iowa State, I somehow felt that it was not as easy as I thought to maintain or at least compete at the national level. And I can remember asking my coach in Ann Arbor, Newt Logan, if and when he ever decided to retire, to let me know, because I felt that I wasn't going to be given quite the opportunity to develop the program any higher than at the Big 8 level. Mm-hmm. And I felt that Michigan was way ahead of us in terms of finances and scholarships and whatever. And I can remember at that point, of course, he stayed there for another 20 years, and so it wasn't like it was going to happen yesterday. But I can remember questioning whether or not I would ever be able to do it at Iowa State, because I was still interested in national champions, not just conference champions. And I can remember that something happened right about the time when Gordon Chalmers left Iowa State to go to Indiana State as athletic director. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why he left was that my understanding was that he had expressed to the board, the athletic council, and to the president of the university that unless Iowa State was able to invest more in financially, that they should not expect to do any better athletically. They didn't like that. And he left. Whether he's forced out or not, I don't know, but at that time, Clay Stapleton was the football coach. And it was common at that time, if the coach was near retirement, that he could be kept on as an athletic director if he was fired as football coach or he was passed over. At any rate, Stapleton was known for being very thrifty. And he called me in and he said, Ed, he said, I want you to understand that there's no way this next year that you're going to be able to spend any more money than you just spent last year. Well, I have to back up here just a little bit, because as I mentioned to you, Gordon Chalmers was very interested in men's gymnastics and had been very favorable to our competitions, our winning, and he felt quite proud of the fact that he had recruited me and that the sport of gymnastics was not doing pretty well. 1 or 2 years before that, he started to allow us to fly to events, to go all over the nation for competitions. I mean, I had spent money, I didn't even have a budget. I just did whatever was necessary in order to compete against the very best schools in the country. And when Stapleton told me that I was not allowed to spend any more than I'd spent the previous year, I couldn't help but jump up and down. I was just so happy. It was unreal, the way that now I had a budget that was way beyond anything I would ever ask for and was more than capable. All of a sudden now I had scholarships and I was ready to go. So at that point, of course, I was quite satisfied in remaining at Iowa State. There's no doubt about it, but that here was where I could get the job done, and I had the finances to accomplish that.
Well, that's great. And you did go on to be nationally recognized, the program.
Our first national championship team was in 1971. But there's a little background to that, in that the year before we were in Philadelphia for the national championships, and we were one of the favored teams. But another favorite team was the University of Michigan, my alma mater. And that was 1970. After the entire competition was over with, 3 days of competition, we were in second place by 1/10 of 1 point. And obviously we didn't win, we were second. Well, the very next year, 1971, and to back up just a little bit, because of our relationship, and I knew Loken at Michigan, we were very close. And he never would agree to have a dual meet competition with us. We would meet in open competitions. We would obviously meet the national championship, but we never had head-to-head competitions. I don't know if he felt like our friendship was such we never wanted to mess that up. And I didn't press him on it. But here was an opportunity now as a young coach. It was 10 years now. That I started in 61, and this was 1971. 10 years, and I was taking the team to the Ann Arbor, Michigan for the National Gymnastics Championships, my alma mater, and that's our first win. We won there. And of course that had to be the highlight of my career in terms of
emotionally as well as skill and just to say to the home folks, here I am.
Well, I don't know if I said that exactly, but I felt so good about the fact that we not only could come back after losing by 10th, but we were able to do it. If there's another place, I would never have chosen it over Ann Arbor to have won it.
Well, that is indeed a high point. And you have, all of the athletes, I'm sure, are special to you. So it's like asking a parent who's their special child. But do you have some anecdotes about your participants that you feel strongly about that you would like to share with me?
Well, as you mentioned, there are a good number of them. We've had a number of national champions. We've had over 50 All-Americans. It would be very difficult to pick any one athlete that meant more than any other. But publicity-wise, people who may have stood out in the public's mind as being so outstanding for Iowa State gymnastics. Brent Simmons was probably the first one. He was an all-around gymnast that was a national all-around champion. He was our first all-around champion at the national level. And he has to stick out, although we had guys that won, like Rusty Hoffman, who was the first pommel horse specialist to ever have won 3 national championships on pommel horse.
Wow.
3 in a row. He actually won 4 in a row in the conference, won 3 in a row on the pommel horse. He was the first to do that. And the first to do something so significant in the sport that at that time was based on a perfect score of 10. This occurred in vaulting by a young man named Ron Gallimore. And Ron Gallimore was an extreme favorite here at Iowa State. Not only did he seem to tumble in floor exercise twice as high as everyone else, his muscles would just stick out whenever he did the iron cross and the rings. And he was the first gymnast in NCAA history to score a perfect 10.
I think that's definitely a good story. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I don't want to press you on that, but thank you for mentioning those particular athletes, because I think people who have followed Iowa State gymnastics would feel that they had those kind of cornerstone careers here, and certainly worthy of that. Well, I don't want to shortchange your collegiate coaching 22 years at Iowa State, but I was hoping we could. Is there anything else you want to say about coaching on the collegiate level before we move on to another way that you're known in Ames?
Oh, actually, I've talked to you quite a bit about the gymnastics part.
So you coached for 22 years, and you were interested in a transition. How did that come about?
Well, sometimes a person feels that lucky that maybe they were successful in a particular area. And I don't know if I just had a feeling like, I wonder if I could be successful at something else. And up to that time, I mentioned Clay Stapleton, who moved from the head coach in football to being athletic director. But there were, over the years that I'd been at Iowa State, very few opportunities for someone to move within the university, within the athletic department, to another administrative position. And the opportunity presented itself right at that time. And I felt like, well, if I don't seize this opportunity right now, I may never have another one. And Carolyn and I definitely felt that we were happy with Ames, and our 2 daughters graduated from Iowa State. And now I have my oldest and my youngest grandson are here as students at Iowa State. And Ames was a great place. And I felt like here was a chance to move into, at the time, it was in public relations, and I really seized the chance and jumped into it. I was then later kind of moved into athletic development, which involved fundraising. But along with that, I was given the responsibility of promotions, and I decided that with the job I had as in athletic development, dealing with gift giving, and that it might be a good match if I were able to get in front of the public a little bit And I felt that if I had this promotion at the basketball game, the shoot 5 for 5, that it would give me a chance, a little more exposure to the givers that were out there. And so I developed this shoot 5 for 5, which at the time was a shot in the dark. I know I asked we'd have staff meetings, and I'd ask them for opinions on whether they thought this type of promotion would work or that type. And one day when it came up that I was working on this promotion, I asked them what their chances, what my chances were of going to a car dealership in Ames and asking them to give a used automobile for 5 baskets. That I would give a prize for 1, 2, 3, 4, but the main prize was going to be a used automobile. And they said, well, 50-50 chance. I went over to Benson Motors, talked to Carl Benson, and I was visiting with him about this idea, and I had brought up the used automobile, and Marge Benson, who his wife was sitting right next door, she always did the bookwork and everything else for the dealership. She heard our conversation. She come running in there, says, we're not giving a used car. She says, we're giving a brand new one. I couldn't believe it, because like I said, I was just hoping, here I was hoping for a $250 used automobile as the top prize for Shoot 5 for 5, and she's offering over a $20,000 automobile. And boy, it just took off from there, and it was really quite an opportunity. And I talked about how I thought this was going to be an opportunity for me to expose myself in front of all these givers and donors so that they felt like they know me. So when I visited with them, it wasn't like they were talking to someone on a computer or something like that, or a robotic call. At any rate, on one occasion, and this happened, that helped the whole development of this promotion, I was injured or sick or something, and I couldn't be at the game. And Max Shurick, the athletic director at that time, said to whoever he had talked to, said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go out there on the floor and do the Shoot 5 for 5. It was going over pretty well at that time, and so he thought it might be fun to do it. Well, when he walked out on the floor, he said, now wait a minute. He said, I'm not Ed, I'm Max Shurick. But he said, Ed can't be here today because he's sick at home, and I think he's watching this on TV. So he said, would you all say hi, Ed, to him? And so they all said hi, Ed. Now, I didn't watch it on TV. It wasn't even, half times aren't showed on TV. And so when I got to the next time that I'm on the floor for a basketball game, I go out there, and I say, hi, everybody. And all of a sudden they come back with, hi, Ed. Wow, it was so loud and boisterous that I thought, couldn't understand what they said. And I thought something went wrong. I did something wrong here. At any rate, it continued on from that time, and yes, even to the very end. And I did it, I guess, from 1983 to 94, about 11 years. 11 years that shoot. Now, actually, I did it for about 3 more years after I retired. They wanted me to do it for a while longer, and then they slowly passed it on to someone else.
One of the signature events that I remember during halftime was sometimes you would come out on a very special conveyance, a unicycle.
I'm often kidded about that because it's amazing how things stay in people's minds. See, I had all the way through high school and college, actually, to help finance my scholarships. Didn't cover everything. My schooling, I had this professional juggling and unicycling act. And so I knew how to ride the unicycle. And so every season, at the very last game of the season, I would ride out on my unicycle, and I'd have the mic, and I would introduce all the prizes and the lucky contestant. And so nowadays, I talk to people about that. They say, still ride your unicycle? And I say, well, I wish I could. But at any rate, they thought I did it every game because I only did it the last game of each season, but it stuck in their mind. And I wish I could do it now from the standpoint that they have these FM type, you don't have to carry a wire around, because I was riding my unicycle trying to avoid running over the wire. And of course, I didn't want to stand in one spot. But at any rate, that was kind of fun. And
your idea for Shoot 5 for 5, you didn't have any trouble getting vendors to donate prizes. I mean, people were practically knocking on your door. Can I sponsor something?
Well, that's true, especially the car dealerships. They wanted to have their automobile on the floor, and when I'd say Benson Motors, after a while, I never did say Benson. And this brand new Skylark from, and I wouldn't even say it. And the audience would say Benson Motors. It was just the funniest thing because, of course, then Benson Motors were the envy of all the other dealerships that they're also supporting the athletic program. They're also giving big money to the program. And they wanted an opportunity to maybe do this game or that game. And because at the beginning I would have them drive the automobile out almost onto the floor with the cheerleaders sitting on the hood and introduce the car. Now they have that area blocked off, and you can't drive a car anymore onto the floor. But at any rate, I felt quite obligated to Marge and Carl. They're the ones that at the very beginning that said, we'll do this.
They took the leap of faith.
Very definitely, and so we stuck with them. But there were the prizes were rather fantastic, and like for instance, for 4 shots, it was $1,000, and I really didn't have any trouble attracting sponsors. I can remember one time, John Huber, who a clothing dealership here in Ames. He was a little hesitant to do this, and I said, "What would I want you to do, though?" It was a $300 prize for 3 shots, and I said, I realize that this is a lot of money, but I said, if the person gets 4 baskets, they don't get your prize. It's not like it's going to be given out every game. They got to have exactly 3 baskets. He said, "Well, all right, I'll do it." Well, he did it, and then he lost. Not the first game, second game, or third, but somewhere along the line he lost. And he had to give away a free suit. Later on I saw him and I kind of cringed because I thought, here's one of those guys that was a little reluctant. I talked him into it. Well, he told me, he said, "Guess what, Ed?" He said, "I had more people come into my store and talk about that shoot for 5 suit that I gave away. And they wanted to know which one it was that I gave away." And he said, I was really glad that I ended up doing that. Now, he only lost, I think it was 1 time. But the point is that most of the sponsors got plenty of recognition for their prize that they offered. I can remember Coors at one time offered, they were one of the ones that offered, it was for I'm trying to think now how it worked out. It was either for $300 or $1,000. And they offered 100 cases of Coors or $1,000. And the students would boo the $1,000. It was the funniest thing that they would boo the money.
And promote the beverage. Yeah. And there was only one person that won in that 11-year string.
Right, and that's a story in itself. Unfortunately, with having awarded the prize only once, you would have wanted someone to be driving around Ames showing off their shoot 5 for 5 winnings. But this gentleman had been Albright was his name, and he had been in the media resource department at Iowa State for a number of years, decided he would take a job in Hawaii, the University of Hawaii. After several years there, he decided it was too expensive to live there. And he was fortunate in being offered his old job back. So he had just got back to Ames. And he didn't have season tickets or anything. Somebody in his department said, "Here, I'm going to give you my tickets, and you go to the game." Well, of all things, his seat is picked. He goes down there and makes 5 baskets. And I mean, that was part of the story. The part that disappointed me a little bit is that after all the years that we were trying to give away this car, we finally did it. But he had just bought a brand new car. And he, as I mentioned, had struggled. I think he had mentioned this coming back from Hawaii because the cost of living there was so high. He couldn't afford to take this second car. Did not need a second car. He didn't want to get rid of the new one he had just bought. And so he took the cash value instead. And I thought, that was fine. It was a great prize, but he had to pay the taxes on it. This was the reason. See, for on a $20,000 automobile, the taxes for like state and federal were like $7,000. And he had to come up with that before they give him the car. And he didn't want to do that. And so he got the cash, and then he gave him the $7,000 out of the cash. So,
well, it's still a good story. In 1994, you retired from Iowa
yes,
State.
right.
You retired,
Mm-hmm.
and but it was last winter,
Mm-hmm.
2015, February, that you were honored in a very special way. Can you? Dave Block, I believe one of your former athletes that you've already mentioned, helped spearhead an interesting campaign. And what happened?
Well, to my surprise, I never would have expected anything like this. And they made the decision that they wanted to hang a banner representing my gymnastics coaching years at Iowa State in Young Coliseum. And that's an honor, I guess. I never would have dreamt of something of that nature occurring. And I'm very humble and terrifically honored about that.
Is there anything else you would like to share with me, a story you would like to tell, or any other remembrance that you have for this Shared Stories project about Ed Gagnier and Iowa State University gymnastics and athletics? Is there anything else you'd like to tell?
Well, I think that if there's any one thing that sticks in my mind, it involves the university primarily, and that is that when I came to Iowa State, the university had approximately 10,000 students. The city of Ames had 10,000. It was a small town, a town that you felt like, gosh, we're comfortable here. We just come from Milwaukee. I lived near Detroit, big cities, and Ames just seemed to be perfect. And you felt like, well, I hope it never changes. And in fact, one of the things that occurred during my coaching years was that whenever we'd go out of town, my gymnasts would oftentimes say, back to Ames. Nothing to do in Ames. And Ames at that time had limited restaurants and theaters or whatever, and things to do were at a minimum. But after the years went along, further along, the gymnasts couldn't wait to get back to Ames. Ames was a special place. And part of it is that not only did Ames grow to the extent that provided these added conveniences, but it has still retained the small town atmosphere. The campus is separate from the city. The uniqueness of it has remained the same. You still feel comfortable in being in Ames. And maybe it's because these other large cities have grown even larger, and in comparison, Ames is still pretty small, which it is. But I think that what has surprised me over the years is how you can live in Ames and be happy and thoroughly convinced that it's the right place to be. In fact, we oftentimes, we read stories about Ames being selected as one of the best places for people to either retire in or to live or work and find work. And I think that's so true, even today, as it was when I first came here in 1961.
Well, thank you very much for your reflections, and good luck in your morning golf games that you have from here on the rest of the summer.
Well, thank you, Teresa. This is a real pleasure for me to visit with you.
Thank you.